Hello and welcome, humans and future sentient silicon beings, to the Fourth Age with Noah and Marty. Today we have Noel Zamot with us. Zamot, excuse me. Uh, he is the author of Archer's Thread that came out in 2021 and it won a lot of awards. And he's now releasing The Feathers Push. He was a former combat aviator who commanded the Air Force's test pilot school. Your resume is already way cooler than mine, by the way. And he worked in technology warfare, specifically, make sure I get this right, how to prevent fighter jets from getting
That
hacked.
is
Is
correct.
that right?
That was back in the day, best job
Um,
ever.
that's awesome. When I was reading that, my first thought was, in this whole AI universe, you protected it from human adversaries, and I really wanted to discuss what would happen if those adversaries are now AI,
Uh,
and if that was something you guys considered.
that's a great question, and what I'm glad to say is that some of my students from that time are actually working on that problem, and the framework that they are using began with essentially counter counter cyber approaches for military aircraft. So it's been a long road. Thanks for having me, by the way.
Awesome. I'm curious? Are they? Is the approach much different? Is it starting to become different? You were mentioning before when we were pre-chatting a little bit about how uh, mathematically it's difficult to show that there's no, you know, adversary in the machine. And so I was wondering if that then projects nicely into AI, if it's the same problem, or if it becomes a much harder
I
problem.
suspect it does, and I'll give you a quick background. This entire thing started many years ago. I was a commander of the Air Force Test Pilot School. It's kind of like being a combination of a fighter squadron commander, a dean of an engineering school, and owner of your own monster garage. We had our own little lab. We did all sorts of cool stuff. Having one of the neatest things we did is out of control, manually control semi-autonomous vehicles from long distances where there's jitter and delays, all sorts of crazy stuff. And one day, senior Air Force leadership comes in and says, "Hey, how do we prevent airplanes from getting hacked? It would be very embarrassing if we have a fifth generation stealth fighter out there and we can't launch because somebody essentially hacked it and it has to stay on the ground." So that began. We used to answer those kinds of questions. And my boss, it was a three-person meeting. This general came down, my boss and myself. And my boss looks at me and says, "You think we can do this?" And of course, the only answer is yes. So we started coming up with a framework where we could figure this out. I know you guys both have very extensive tech backgrounds. My tech background was more on the system side. So we looked at the problem from the point of view of how can we design a system or fix a system so that even if there is an adversary in it, you can still carry out your mission. Later on, and we were talking about this previously, I was at a conference and I told people, hey, you need to assume that there's a bad guy living in your systems already. 90% of the people were horrified. How can you dare say that? About 10% of the people came up and said, "You're right, and we need to take this problem more seriously." So back to your question, uh, the issue is how to make a system resilient, anti-fragile. Some people may use that word by design. And I think right now we are in a really interesting juncture, inflection point in history, because the advent of AI requires us to design systems that are resistant to AI based intrusion. I think there will be parallels between that and cyber. Cyber hardening obviously requires you to address a lot of the vulnerabilities and the apertures that you may have. I think what AI brings to the adversary is a capability to be more subtle with those attacks so that those attacks don't look like an adversary, but look like a friendly guy or an attack that can fool the human, who is usually the weakest link in that chain. But that approach of allowing the system to still carry out its mission, even though it's carrying the baggage of adversaries on it, remains.
Well,
Oh,
another point of attack for AI would be for subtlety would be attacking ancillary systems. I'm reminded there's a famous Turing Award lecture called "Trusting Trust," where one of the people that created C points out that because we currently write compilers to compile themselves, there's actually an advanced form of information hiding that allows you to write more compact, more readable code, but also allows people creating those systems to insert effectively indetectable backdoors into not merely those systems, but every system that uses that tool suite to build itself, which at this point in time is every system. And there's actually a
There was a
well,
contest to do that. There was a contest where people tried to insert backdoors into the, and someone
yeah,
inserted it into the compiler.
there aren't just contests to do this. I saw a report of a live case uh, of Thompson's backdoor actually appearing in the wild. And there's another
Wow.
story about a Tiger team from, I believe, the 70s. IBM had created a a system for the military that was so bulletproof that they simply couldn't hack it. And so what they did was they broke into an IBM satellite office to steal the stationery, and then wrote up a patch. This is back in the days when patches arrived by mail and you manually keyed them in.
Paper.
They wrote up a patch on IBM stationery that included the hack, that would create it and sent that in, and then used the hole that they got them to insert into the system. So those kinds of spam attacks where you don't merely need to protect your people and protect your systems, but you also need to protect all of the people and all of the systems that communicate with any of the people or systems that communicate with any of your people or systems. And suddenly, unless the entire planet is fully secured, you've been penetrated.
So if I can pull on that thread, you're absolutely right. Uh, a platform which shall not be named had exactly that problem in that the maintenance system that was used to perform all sorts of diagnostic tests on the platform was not hardened. So, and nobody really thought about that until much later. They just said, well, we'll just put the, our standard, antivirus packages and whatever. Nobody really thought of the fact that, uh, that was insufficient. Everybody thought, well, if I have a laptop and I install whatever antivirus on it, it will by definition be impervious to absolutely everything out there. And of course, it wasn't. Worse yet was the fact that they said, well, we have to freeze the architecture because it's too hard to make builds, and then that software, that OS, was essentially frozen. So you get into the situation where you have this massive glaring uh, aperture into this system, and you realize that to properly secure it, like Noah, you correctly said, you have to go back so far into the world that it's going to cost more than you know all of the world's reserves of gold to fix. And that goes back to the systemic approach, which is to say, let's just assume that somebody found a way to get into this. Can we design a system, not that will be secure, but that can actually perform its mission when it's under attack, essentially? And that robustness, that anti-fragility, that we used to have a name for it back in the day, mission assurance, is really, I think, in a highly complex world, these quote simplistic architecture approaches may be the easiest. And I think the parallel with AI is massive. Right now we have this. Marty, I think you said in one of the earlier podcasts that something that happened last week is history. It's old history now, and you're right. In a world where the advancement is so vast, what can possibly be secured? I don't know if any of us have the answer, but I suspect that at some point there is going to be some simplicity that yields some underlying strength, or otherwise we're going to have the de facto Butlerian jihad that happens just because we need to. You'll have AIs going against AIs, and the rest of the world would just turn away in boredom and indifference.
We've tried to make it an analogy, and I've wondered if this is something that's been discussed, like in the military. I think Noah and I have had chats about if we get to the spot where the adversaries are using AI, we're using AI, the AI is fighting it, how close is that to basically, nuclear weapons where, we're no longer sending in armies to do the battles. There's no swords, there's no guns. We just blow each other up and it's done. Uh, do we take the human out of the equation and then do we just go about our way while the AI fights it out?
So that's a really good question. I'm going to answer that with not with a good answer, but with another thought experiment. Nuclear weapons. We all saw Oppenheimer. That was pretty amazing what that created. I was in, like any guy who flew bombers back in the day. It's no secret. I pulled alert. I pulled nuclear alert. I was quite familiar in my time working at Cheyenne Mountain with what we call special weapons. That has taken a
Wow.
while to mature, right? The concept of deterrence, single integrated operations plan, all of that has matured to the point that even though Russia invaded Ukraine and they, threatened tactical nukes, and tactical nukes actually were at least thought of being deployed to Belarus. That has not happened. We have not had Armageddon. But I would submit to you, I would suggest that that do loop, that decision loop is still ongoing because it's going on at human scale. So we are still undergoing the military analysis and the diplomatic engagement and the economic whatever it may be. And behind it, there's this, a lot of intelligence activity that goes on. Compare that to two AIs going back and forth. Those are not human timelines. You're not having a weapons development timeline and a diplomatic timeline. You're talking about I created an algorithm that can spoof you, and I am now creating another one that can find out whether that was a spoof. So this one learns from the other, and now you have essentially two massive models going against each other. Number one, I don't think they're AGI, and I don't think we have AGI yet. So we're looking at, two neural networks, essentially two massive transfer functions going against each other. The problem is that timeline will come a point where the limitation is the speed of light, right? It's computational speed is going to be the limit. And what does that look like? I have no idea. We're in the vertical, progress in the vertical part of the progress curve right now. Where does that level off? Where does that solution converge, or at least taper off, or at least does it go off into infinity? I have no idea, but it is terrifying. So, we've known for years that in general, a human with an AI will outperform both a human and a non-guided AI. And by AI, I mean some sort of machine learning model or some sort of neural network or something. Are we beyond that? When we are beyond that, then becomes, I think, a significant peril to let these things essentially operate on their own against another AI with some sort of bounds, without some sort of bounds.
Noah, Noah and I have talked about how we're beyond that with
Correct.
chess now. That with chess, yeah, having a human and a computer is more detrimental than just having the
Correct.
computer.
I agree with you on we're not at AGI, and I would contend that we're, computationally speaking, not close. Although I guess there's some brain scans of people with severe strokes that might suggest that we might be closer than it might be suspected. But
Yeah.
I think those are good points. I don't have your background with nuclear, but as part of my training in nuclear engineering, we did discuss proliferation and considerations there. It's part of
Yep.
the considerations in safety in constructing a reactor, because obviously some of the material that you produce either is or could be contributory towards devices that would be unattractive, both dirty bombs and actual atomic weapons. Um, and so I'm aware of some of those things. Uh, the the thing that I'd like to sort of dig into with you is finding it scary that as I contend, all of our existing political, social, economic, and cultural institutions have no future, and instead embrace the joy and challenge that we actually now have to build new ones that are going to work, and go into that mission capable concept you were talking about. To my ears, you'd said anti-fragile, robust. What that sounds like to me, from my game theory practice, is effectively strategic optimization. And the basic plan for strategic optimization when you have opponents is you want to create situations where the best thing that they can do is to you, from their point of view, is as little bad as possible from your point of
Sure.
view. And
Yeah.
so and in many cases you ideally want to reach the point where you're actually indifferent to your opponent's actions. There's a story based on an Edgar Allan Poe character, uh, and I'm not going to be Monsieur Dupin, who's sort of a forerunner to Sherlock Holmes, and he's talking about. I don't think it's rock paper scissors. I think it's a different game, but it's a similar kind of game to rock paper scissors. And he always wins. And the reason he always wins is because he has this thing where he takes on the facial characteristics of his opponent, and that allows him to take on the mental characteristics of opponent and know what his opponent is going to do. And and
Know thy
so
enemy.
because he knows what you're going to throw, he knows what to throw to defeat you. And the solution, the game theory solution, is for you to choose randomness, to not know what you yourself are going to do, because then your opponent can't have the information. And yes, you lose a third of the time, and yes, you win a third of the time, and yes, it's a tie a third of the time. But since the alternative is guaranteed loss, uh, and there's actually, you can find video. This is years and years and years, like over a decade ago, somebody actually designed a robotic arm to win rock paper scissors against human beings, and it's not using any kind of machine learning or AI or anything special. It's simply throwing about 1/1000th of a second behind the human being, um, and human senses can't distinguish between that and simultaneous, and so it simply throws the winning thing after you. And so, that's that same kind of notion. We have so many things built into fairness and reciprocity and so on in all of our systems that are based on the idea that human neural tissue will make decisions and human flesh will sort of drive action. And now that we have machines that can come close to approximating those things, um, these systems need to be retooled at a very, very basic level if they're going to survive. Or, well, they're not going to survive, but if we're going to survive with new
Yeah.
institutions.
That's a so
So,
in a
can,
prosaic way, that's the plot of book two. Which I don't know if this is a good time to bring it up, but the first book
yes,
talked
please.
about it's the first book is about a guy who can see 10 seconds into the future for reasons we found out later, and what happens when he meets somebody who um, he can't see ahead of her. But it's all based on science. Your phone can tell you what the weather is going to be 10 seconds to the future, what stocks are going to be, or anything. Imagine it if a human had that capability. The second book is about a girl who can sense emotions by touch. You find out they're related uh, for some reasons. But a big undercurrent of it is on purpose is an AI using social media to manipulate some folks. And what would happen if somebody could actually understand what the truth was about something instead of uh, relying on the manipulation that an AI can have on our puny little primate brain? And it's funny because some of the feedback that I got from the book with some friends, there's a scene where a guy is basically taken away and said, "Listen, dude, everything you've been uh, arming yourself about for these past few weeks, and it's not really even that long, is a lie. And here we are showing you that this is a lie. It is an AI created lie delivered by a very sophisticated social media construct that sound familiar. And the guy goes, "No, I don't believe it." There's even a quote. He says, "Well, I haven't seen the Pope either, but he's real, right? So why should I not believe in that?" So you get to a situation, and this is what I really wanted to write about, where you can have humans who are otherwise completely logical basically say, "No, this did not happen. 1 + 1 does not equal 2 because I saw it somewhere, and even though you tell me that's a lie, I will believe it." So now we get to the point of that being, a cult, religion, whatever you may want to call it, but it is indistinguishable from that. We are predisposed in a way to see those patterns, to believe, to want to believe, even when confronted with the opposite. That to me is a part that terrifies me about where we're going. And this is where I talk about the Butlerian jihad. What happens if we have a delivery system out there that basically says, "I'm going to tilt the table into this side of the political spectrum," or whatever, and another one that says, "No, I won't." Now you basically have this information mutually assured destruction, perhaps is a bad term to use, but this interaction between multiple of these
right.
AIs. Where does the human sit?
Yeah, there's a point I brought up on other podcasts before, but the Google Translate, which is AI in one sense, but in another sense is really just a very, very large probability engine. And it's using large numbers of human produced texts that are translated into two different languages. And when you say, what's the translation of, this phrase in Swahili to that phrase in Turkish, what it does is grabs its Swahili Turkish pair documents, finds the phrase that you're looking for in Swahili, and then does a big search, sifting through all the matching Turkish documents to figure out what they have in common, and says, okay, whatever they have in common is what the translation of this phrase in Swahili is. That system started outperforming human translators quite some time ago. But one of the things that's interesting is that it introduces the possibility of an attack vector, particularly if you have human level document production in an automated way. Suddenly, I could, if I wanted Turkish people to think that the Swahili word for, rental car was Noah Healy's rental car, I could insert ads at the
Yes.
translator level and essentially hack the
Yes.
brain of their phone to get them to explain. As you're saying, the same thing, political campaigns, social media campaigns, um, marketing campaigns to a very large extent involve text, written or spoken material being disseminated through digital channels. And we now have machines that can produce college level work that's
Correct.
relatively indistinguishable. So, what if thousands of voices or hundreds of thousands of voices, not speaking with one voice, but rather speaking with multiple voices, could take some of these so-called AI hallucinations and bat them up the chain? It could be done in service of specific political positions. It could also be done in the service of chaos. Um, just as a
Correct.
prank, you could uh, decide to try to create the impression that China had invaded the Ukraine and that Putin was innocent, and just see how far the AIs could go through social media channels. Um,
100%. And the only, so I'll pull on that thread. You said at college level, the production of text and material at college level. The horrifying part is that to be massively effective, you don't need to be anywhere close to that level because your intended target does not need to consume information at that level. And that's really the most horrifying one. Max Tegmark in Life 3.0, we are living through the introduction of that book right now. There's some things that are different, mostly having to do with, attorneys and lawsuits and things of that nature. But there's a quote in the book, the capability of some of these AIs to just pull on really behavioral strings is effectively infinite for us, especially when you're talking about a type of communication that does not need to be very sophisticated at all to create the intended effect. So
I wanted to ask a question that I may have a misunderstanding or of how the military operates, but we talked about indifference being a winning strategy, and I think was it War Games, the
yes,
1983 movie, had the I don't, if anybody has not watched it,
yeah,
go watch it, and I'm not going to worry
yeah,
about spoilers here, but the ending line is essentially the winning move is not to play, and I think that was what Mutual Assured Destruction was
correct,
really about. The winning move
correct.
is not to play. And I'm wondering if we start to get into this AI world, it's not about not to play, but it's about building a world where we don't have to play. And I'm wondering if the winning strategy here is to come up with some game theoretic approach where the AI could do whatever it wants all day. We happily go about our lives while it does something else, or the AI decides there's no point in playing.
That's a great question. That's actually it's something that I'm trying to come to terms with. Here's a couple of thoughts, really for the next book I'm writing and the one after that. Let's assume for the moment that you have the chess example. I thought was great. Right now, if we
Mhm.
go into diagnostic medicine, essentially reading images, and you're a physician, you will
Right.
still do better with an AI than a physician alone or an AI alone. That's just kind of where we are in state of the art. In
Mhm.
5 years, it may completely change. But right now, a physician that is using AI to identify tumors from imagery, an MRI, any other sort of imagery is probably going to do better.
That's the best in
Correct.
the world.
But you
Uh-huh.
correctly stated that an AI, a human helping an AI at chess, is not necessarily going to do better than the other one. And a big question is, why is that? I would submit that the externalities of that game of chess are in a way minimal, right? Um, if I
Mhm.
win that game
Mhm.
of chess or not, the world is not going to change. Imagine
Mhm.
now a different situation where I choose to ignore a barrage of a million bots telling me that Putin did not invade Ukraine, that it was actually Poland that invaded Ukraine, and that you know that happened, and people start believing that. I may be completely isolated from that, but I live in a world where the context, the soft context, diplomacy, economics, politics, policy, uh, migration, will be materially affected by that fabrication. So the combination of AI and zero barriers to entry for all of the world's 8 billion eyeballs, 16 billion eyeballs on average, uh, is really the terrifying prospect. It's not that AI is out there. It's not that AI may be able to play Go better than I can or choose stocks better than I can, although that is an issue. It's a fact that there's going to be a bunch of people who are going to absolutely believe that something is true and have no idea that it was a completely manufactured tale for the purposes of somebody else. That, I think, is the core mechanic.
Yeah, and one of the themes I keep thinking about is every time someone says this is going to be scary with AI, it's almost always the story that it's already happening. So Russia is really good at controlling their media internally, and everybody seems to believe that they're in the right within Russia, except for the few that get out and talk
Correct.
about it on Reddit. And I've wondered how much the U.S. is the same. I don't want to. I don't think we should steer clear of any politics, but it sure seems like we live in a political world where people only watch either MSNBC or Fox
Correct.
News.
So that's a great question. So let me ask a thought experiment here. I don't know your political
Yeah.
parties. Doesn't really matter. can you access information right now on the web that says A, that the 2020 election was stolen, and B, that it was not? You
Yeah,
can access
absolutely.
both of those, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you have to essentially make up your own mind. Go to China. Now ask on their search engine, what happened at Tiananmen Square?
Right.
And nothing
Right.
will come up.
There's only one
Correct.
answer.
Go to Russia
Yeah.
and say, who does Crimea belong to? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So go to North Korea. Well, they don't have internet, so that's another story. But you get the point. So what
Yeah.
happens in a world where an AI is doing battle with another one, so to speak, and one has a completely different worldview because the data set that it has been trained on has been highly pruned to conform to the dicta of that particular society who created it. I think that's problematic. Perhaps, however, it may be our only hope, right? Because if you are actually deploying something that is by definition incomplete and inconsistent with observed facts, that presents its own opportunities. So who knows?
Are you familiar with The Child
Interesting.
Cycle by Gordon Dixon?
Uh, I can't say I am.
It's pretty good. It's incomplete. Dixon sadly died before he could finish it. It came out just after The Lord of the Rings and was sort of a sci-fi version. Tolkien was sort of trying to create a past mythology for England that would be specifically English. Um, Dixon was sort of trying to chart the future of humanity, and write this thing. So it came out long before Dune, for example, and plumbs much the same waters in a very, very different fashion. Um, Dixon poses a couple of interesting questions. One, if a committee of apes were to set about to create a super ape, would they design a human being? Um, and then two, he posits this sort of future of open and closed societies, and in the market system. Open societies, because the closed society could essentially concentrate its entire focus on a single individual and crush them. Open societies would get torn apart. And so it was necessary for political and economic institutions to systematically disadvantage the closed parties. Now, it's science fiction and to some extent fantasy, and so ultimately human beings manage to evolve into some new form of superhuman, through the auspices of a time traveling reincarnator that got
Holy cow!
started in the 1300s. Uh, but yes, if you have any taste for military science fiction, or you've mentioned the Butlerian Jihad a couple of times, so I think you like Dune.
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
imagine that you would like quite a lot of the Child Cycle. Uh, so that's
Yeah,
a
I'm taking a note. Uh, by the way, the reason for Dune is, of course, we're all we can declare here that we all are science fiction aficionados. That's a book that I've read, I don't know, 3 times, 4 times, and every time you read it, you get something new out of it, as a true classic should. And I think it's most important to read it now, really, to understand. I think a couple of things. This is not an advertisement, or but number one, the whole concept of humanity realizing early on that thinking machines were a threat and how they went about that, I think, is fascinating. Uh, you know, I, I'm uh, the Archer thread is being considered for adaptation to the screen, which is like one of the coolest things ever.
Oh wow.
And I, so because of that, I am peripherally aware of what's going on, and the writer strike to a slightly different degree than just the people on the street, just because I know what the timeline and the barriers and the whole process to get something to the screen may be. And I would submit that a little tiny Butlerian jihad is happening in that corner of the creative world because they realize that without some appropriate controls on this technology, you really could have what tomorrow will look like a great idea. Yeah, increase in shareholder price. But then 2 years from now is going to look like a disaster. Everything looks the same and creativity has died. So, it's really interesting to see how that plays out from the point of view of a science fiction book that was written in the 60s talking about, economic and ecological catastrophe. Not sure how much Frank Herbert knew that he was going to be topical in the 2020s. I think it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing about the people that really manage to hook into some of those things, and why even some of the golden age science fiction, where they're traveling through space and slide rules, but they're still hooked into specific things about uh, sort of the humanity inherent in interstellar travel and what happens to
Yeah,
people when they're forced not to interact with one another for multiple generations,
yeah.
and that sort of thing, um, is an
That
interesting thought
comment about
experiment.
slide rules. That comment about slide rules, by the way. I just think it's interesting because why did we think that? Well, because when we were writing these fantastic books, we're jumping ahead several generations of technology. We'll go to the stars, and how do we do that? But we only have, what we have in front of us to extrapolate to. And at the time, that was slide rules. And I've read a couple of books where the messages did not come through screens; they came through, I don't know, little paper devices that vanished or what have you. And to us now, they made read as quaint. I think the better ones capture a human story that is timeless, and that's why they are classics. Here's a question, and I read this the other day: is speculative fiction dead? Because by the time you actually write something, technology will have caught up to you. We are now in that, in the 50s, there were probably 10 years where space technology really did not make that much of a leap. In the 60s, things started, accelerating. You look at a 1990s movie now, and you go, of course, I would have solved this with a text or or a call or whatever. I just scan a QR code. That was it. I think it was The Graduate, where he has to find the phone booth. And that's a key plot point. That would never happen now. So we are
Yeah.
now accelerating where those time periods. Oh, movies from 20 years ago look quaint because I could solve that with my iPhone. That could happen in 6 months, 2 months, a week. Where is that?
Oh, I know how to solve this. I know how to solve this. I don't know how many times I couldn't get the damn projector to work. So that technology will never be solved. 2D printers will
Yep,
never be solved. So if you want to ensure a book will be forever, just center it around a 2D printer,
that's
projectors,
probably true.
and
Yeah,
getting Zoom calls
that's
to
right.
work
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
first try.
Making sure that uh, you don't answer
No,
spam or something.
I, yeah. Now I had a question. I wanted to dig in a little bit. I guess a little bit onto your military background. Remind me. You mentioned something in sort of the pre-chat about um, boundaries being necessary for creativity. Would you repeat that real
Yes.
quick?
So we lived in Spain. I was on a NATO assignment back in the day. So best thing you can do, really, to be a good American citizen, I think, is travel the world. Quite honestly, and there's a lot more there. But we traveled
Yeah.
to Germany, and we were in Hamburg with our sons, and we went to this museum. And if you've never been to a German museum, this was fantastic. They go very, very deep into some very, very uh, focused areas. And this was a history. I believe it was a history of transportation museum. And I forgot most of what I saw, but what I do remember is this one exhibition, and it basically said something to the tune of true creativity can only flourish when faced with constraints. So, the opposite of that statement is if there are no constraints, every solution looks like a ball or a circle because you just fill all available space. But as soon as you have some constraint, you have to come up with some creativity to go around it. My wife used to fly airplanes, and now she got promoted. First, she got promoted to mom, and now she got promoted to a middle school science teacher. and she loves it. And one of the things that she loves the most is engineering design challenges. So the engineering design challenges is, here is string, tape, and I don't know, 10 straws. Make a structure 7 feet tall. No instructions, but there's constraints and there's time, and invariably that is what the kids most enjoy, because people enjoy being creative, and where they succeed because they did not know that they could, think quote unquote outside the box. So I think that's topical in the discussion of AI, because there's too many tools out there that, if improperly used, will actually not improve your creativity. Actually, it will actually stifle it. And I would hate to see a world where little kids are never exposed to, scarcity or constraints or what have you, because I don't think that's going to have a great effect on our society.
Right. And so one of the areas I'm really curious about is where AI breaks boundaries, in which case all the creativity we had into engineering against those boundaries break. And I wanted to tell you a little story about that I think would relate to your experience with the military. At Pinterest, I ran a team at one point that focused on spam. And it's one of the few areas in social media where you actually deal with an adversary. And so I'm assuming you'll appreciate this. One of our core strategies centered around OODA loops on how to work with our adversary. We also had one of my the lead architect on this was a guy named Chris Walters, and he came up with a beautiful algorithm that basically showed how a spammer operates, and it really focused on money. And that being a closed feedback loop meant that we could really put the screws, twist the screws on them. But we also saw some really neat things, some really neat boundaries. We really started to try to really understand the boundaries of the whole problem. And one of the boundaries I thought was the most fascinating, and now I'm worried is one of the most broken by AI, was besides state actors, spammers tend to only be in teams of about 4 or 5 or 6 at the most. And I always thought it was partly because of no honor among thieves. And we actually saw this happen. There was a case where there was a group of about 5 spammers, and they each have different jobs, and one was the hacker. The hacker got in, got a whole bunch of database of passwords, but then you said, screw these guys, this is worth 150,000, and he absconded with it. And these guys all carry guns, they walk around with sacks of cash. That's the world they live in. But that's awesome for us defenders, because the biggest they can ever be is about 5 or 6 before the vibration among the thieves rips the whole thing apart, right? Again, it doesn't work for state actors. AI destroys that notion, I think, because now I could have a team of 5, but with ChatGPT, am I effectively having a team of 500? And what I'm kind of curious about is where this also comes into, say, the military, where whether or not it's discussed, I assume that there's boundary conditions being assumed or maybe even discussed, such as, Russia or China can only have so many people. There's not 10 trillion people in the world. So, okay, so there's a limit, and there's only so many missiles they have. And we assume they only have this, we have similar technology to them. And we assume that they acquire technology at a certain rate. And I guess what I'm wondering is what happens to those assumptions if they're just blown to bits, and our creativity could be blown to bits too if we don't have any limits. If we just assume the other side is infinitely far away from us and anything is on the table. I'm just curious if that's the sort of thing that's discussed at the military level.
So, I retired 10 years ago. So now what I will say is that my students are now on the bleeding edge of that question. And, part of me is very glad because they were all smarter than I was. So as it should be. So I don't have an answer, but here's a couple of thoughts. You don't need mass on mass with an AI attack. I think Noah at the beginning used the word subtlety for AI attacks, and I think that's really where the danger lies. Let's just back to your comment on OODA loop, right? Observe, orient, decide, act for our listeners. It's a time-tested. John Boyd came up with it to describe air combat, but it basically describes almost all of human decision making.
Any confrontation.
You see something, you
Right.
kind of make sense of it, you decide, you make a call, and then you take an action, and then that goes back and forth. So Imagine an UDA scenario where you are policing, I don't know, the Black Sea. Not that that would ever happen, because we want grain to flow from a country that produces a lot of grain to the rest of the world. If you're an adversary, what would you do? You go back to Sun Tzu, attack your weakest enemy first, right? So where is that? Well, with AI, you can actually shape that battlefield to your advantage, not necessarily by being blunt, but by being subtle. That could be anything from, uh, maybe all you need to do is create a little bit of uncertainty and chaos. If you have some sensors giving you indication of something, but other sensors giving you a very different indication, that already creates a delay in the processing of whatever target you have. If my radar tells me that I have 12 ships over here, but I don't have a visual contact of that, and I have internet chatter that says that those 12 ships are actually there, and I have some satellite feed that gives me an IR, now you have 5 stovepipes that are giving you 3 different possible solutions, and you have to spend time figuring out which one is false. Are you going to make a type 1 or type 2 error? We have to decide these things. So that, I think, is one of the more challenging concerns when you're talking about, not just tactical battlefield, robot coming after you, but an operational level engagement where social, informational, economic, political, all that factors into the military solution. And that can, yeah, I know that there's people working on that right now. I would bet next month's retirement check on that, and next month's client paycheck on that, because that is the issue of our times.
Another point there is that
Wow.
that 10 trillion is that's something that's actually really possible. So, for example, in the financial space, there are more hedge funds than there are traded issues on the New York
Yeah,
Stock Exchange.
sure.
And with the ability to produce billions of things, the individual power levels don't need to be as high in order to get these sorts of responses. One of my
Yep.
favorite biological systems I've ever heard of, there's this bush that lives in the Amazon rainforest. It can't grow very high. Um, it has no spines. It isn't poisonous. In fact, the, the, the the bush itself is hollow, and the base of the leaves has a little dew point that releases sap. So it basically sweats sugar water 24/7. Um, the leaves are juicy; they're good to eat. The reason nothing attacks this is that it's evolved a co-relationship with a certain breed of ant that doesn't need workers to gather food, doesn't need workers to build chambers because the plant does all of that. And so 90+% of these ants are those ones with the enormous trap jaw heads. And these things can drive away large predators, both plant and animal. So, like if a bird lands on this thing, thousands of ants will swarm up its legs, bite it as hard as possible, and hang on. And the bird leaves. The ants are gone. They're dead. They don't care. They've defended the nest. That's what they're there for. Um, and that's a very different thing. These kinds of attacks. Why would 5 people choose to be 500 people? Why wouldn't 5 people choose to be 5 billion people? What if they simply take over your model and become most of your user base? And now any attempt by you to interfere with their spam system causes you to be forced to declare to your revenue model that most of the ads they're serving are going to, meaningless noise. Um, and why would only one team of 5 people choose this particular avenue of attack? Why wouldn't all teams of one or more spammers
You know,
choose to simply take over?
very, very true. And that's again, that's book two. That's the nightmare scenario where you basically have some sort of neural network, some sort of LLM, large language model that can be wielded. I don't think, I'm not at the point of AGI yet in what I'm writing. I'm at the point of somebody wielding these machines or these creations to drive exactly what you're talking about. What is the limit there? If I have identified my population, by the way, I can identify and cull my population very easily using those same tools. So there will come a point where we'll basically just say, okay, now is the time to become, the ant who protects the sugar bush. The one part that I think may offer some hope is based on an observation of our current environment. We have extremely effective outlets on both sides, and I'm just going to use a political example once again. We have extremely effective political machines out there to, quite frankly, manipulate minds at scales that we have not seen since the printing press. But there's more than one. So one cannot claim primacy over the other because they're both there. So in a population, the U.S. has, I don't know, 330 million people right now. Let's just say that 200 million of those are of voting age. Let's divide that into quarters. One quarter's on one camp, one quarter's on the other one. The remainder are somewhere in the middle. That's your trade space right now. You actually have demonstrated that I can create the ant plant symbiosis, but I can do it more than once in really two camps that are, in a way, almost mutually exclusive. What does that mean? I think we're about to find out. Does that mean that some people are more susceptible to some type of control than others? That's terrifying in itself. Is it the effectiveness of the message? Is it your adherence to the truth? Is there some sort of message migration? Symbolic migration of the message that will sort of creep in from the edges and have more people follow it? I have no idea, but I think we're going to find out.
Well, and yeah, we know that human beings are susceptible to mass formation psychosis is the modern
Yes,
term, but
absolutely.
uh, the Salem witch trials, there's a number, Saint Vitus dance. There's lots and lots of examples throughout
The
history.
Crusades.
The
I mean,
Crusades,
yeah.
even foot binding. Um,
Oh yeah, yeah.
Foot binding is not some deeply ancient Chinese, patriarchy thing. It was an imperial favorite concubine from, I think, less than 200 years ago, who happened to be born with a club foot, who decided to create a fashion to create an entire
That's right.
generation of club-footed girls so that she could blend in, and and that it had enough cachet to keep going for about a century.
Yeah,
Um, so yeah, I mean, people can be convinced to do things that are directly harmful to themselves in order
completely
to.
contrary. Yes, 100%. That's and how do you get to that quote unquote bottom line, to that quote unquote truth? Whatever that may be. Uh, that's the question I try to answer in book two. But from not in the realm of fiction and the realm of reality, uh, how do we do that in the real world? I suspect, again, back to this writers and actors strike, that will inform how we move forward in other ways. Because I think what we will find out, much like GDPR changed the face of privacy globally, even though it was only designed to affect the EU, that has actually had measurable impact beyond its borders, uh, arguably in a positive way. Uh, on not on the realm of privacy, but on the realm of you know uh, rights to creative works and AI authorship and all that. What will this provide? I think we will, over the next 5 years, possibly, maybe a lot sooner, see some of the echoes of that in our discourse on how AI controls opinion at scale.
Well, that gets into one of the reasons I actually wanted to start this and why I call it, came up with the idea of the fourth age,
Yeah,
um, is that yeah the systems that we've been using. Politics isn't much of one, but the judiciary process is supposedly a source of truth, and the markets are supposed to be a source of economic information. Um, and then
yes.
journalism, all of these things have been sharply negatively impacted by just the very primitive levels of computational engagement that presently exist.
I would
Judges
completely agree.
don't have the technical sophistication to understand what it means to make the decisions that they're making about technology IP, and the influences of these various things. The markets, BlackRock actually is an example of a human aided AI that that used itself to sort of lever up, and Renaissance Technologies claims that they've gotten past the point where they actually have anything to offer their AIs, but they're a very closed shop, so nobody really knows what's going on in there. Um, and
During the Sam Altman discussion at Congress, I think one of the senators, congressman, said that he self-admitted that he doesn't have the tools
Oh
to
yeah,
deal with this. It's like,
any
great. So you got to make a decision
absolutely
though.
right. And anytime you have one of these events, one of these hearings, belong to a little chat group, and nobody goes, "Did you see what happened on this one?" Because many of the questions that come up are completely divorced from any knowledge of the topic, and those are, okay. So we can go back and say, well, the founding fathers and all this. I don't think the founding fathers expected ChatGPT or Bitcoin or any of that stuff. So there is now. Possibly a need to have politicians be more like technocrats than anything else, because you really need an understanding of these technologies to make a useful judgment call when it comes to politics and public policy.
I'd
Um,
say actually the real teardown isn't so much that they'd have to be technocrats, but that for rule of law to exist, laws need to be public and coherent. And so they would have to have the technical capacity to create coherent law, which they have not done and are not doing. And so there would have to be effectively an upper limit in how much entropy could exist in the entire legal and regulatory code of a government. And that upper limit would probably be, well, strictly speaking, if it had to be guaranteed to be sub computational, that upper limit would be, I think, 27 bits in total, which might sound bad, but they'd get 9 whole English words out of it. Uh, and so that would be the upper limit. Now it's possible to construct provably non-computational systems that are larger than 27 bits. It's just that we know that there exists a 28-bit description of a fully computational system. Uh,
so I have a very prosaic example of what you said, and this may be way off, but I'll say it anyway. So uh, one of the more interesting jobs I had was to be the infrastructure czar in Puerto Rico. I was born in Puerto Rico, and I had the good fortune of being asked to serve under a congressionally appointed role and essentially bring in a bunch of outside uh, investment to the island as part of the island's bankruptcy proceeding.
Wow.
Long story, we'll chat about it with a beer some other time. But our piece of law that my entire remit was based on was, I don't know, 15 pages of federal statute, public law 114, 187, Title 5. That went through the entire process, and nobody found out until we are in the middle of trying to execute this and making things happen and bringing investment. We had an $8 billion investment pipeline that was interested in investing on the island, that there was a mistake in the law, a pretty egregious, factual, completely missed, did not even finish this question, uh, whopper in the law. And it wasn't like, oh, I can think about that. No, no, no. It was like if you were talking and suddenly stopped talking, and then somebody else, Siri transcribed your overheard communication into something ridiculous.
It's like those old community lines where you hung up the phone and
Sure.
somebody else picked up and their conversation
Exactly.
is happening. Yeah.
So here's the thought experiment. I could input that into, and maybe I should. I'll do that for giggles. I could input that into, I could go into Chat GPT and say, assume the role of legal review, right? Because smart prompting, that's all I need to do.
Yeah.
Pretend you are a legal
Yeah.
reviewer. Evaluate this text for completeness and accuracy. Give me la 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 la, and it would probably pump out 3 pages of this is inconsistent, this is a risk, these are all that. So arguably, had I had this capability then, I would have been able to craft a better piece of legislation. And this is, no, you're saying
Wow.
this is the very rudimentary levels of quote AI. It's really LLMs that we're dealing with right now. But nobody's looking at that. Should we? I'll leave that up for a question. But that's, we talk about doom and gloom, and I'm the happiest person to talk about that because it's fascinating. But on a more fundamental, prosaic manner, these tools could actually help the discourse on public policy by being a dispassionate, factual evaluator of otherwise very complicated documents that we write.
Yeah. One risk,
I'm
though,
loving this.
is that when you add capacity, one of the things that people do is they actually increase the amount of work they do, a la Parkinson. So there's been a review of Supreme Court decisions over the last century plus, and before World War II, they basically never had clerks. And of course, now there's a very extensive and very prestigious clerking system that's built into our society of how legal foundations and judgeships and so on work. And as a result, the total number of words produced by the Supreme Court each session has ballooned enormously,
Oh yeah.
which is precisely counterproductive to the creation of a simple and comprehensible.
You're absolutely,
Let's make Supreme Court GPT.
very true. And so a lot of people are talking about, ChatGPT is going to solve all the world's problems because now I can produce a lot of content and put it out there. And I go, that's exactly the point. Now we are awash in garbage. The equivalent of when you go get a recipe and you have to page down 20 pages before you get to the ingredients.
Yeah.
That is now happening at scale. Why? Because the barriers to entry to verbosity have been reduced to zero. Is that a good use? I'm not sure, but I can see around the corner that there's going to be another
I'm sure.
AI dedicated to, reducing that overload. And now we're back into the do loop.
Yes, yeah, I'm sure it's very bad, and we absolutely have to do something about it. Although there is a certain degree of self-interest because I have almost no verbosity capability, and I'm working against this huge sea of noise problem to sort of get my signal actually heard.
I think in the vein of reducing amount of information out there, we're at time. Maybe we should call it, which I'm sad about because this is one of the most fun conversations I've had ever. I wanted thank you, Noel, for joining us. The book, The Archer's Thread, came out 2021. It sounds like the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Alec Baldwin's coming out. I wanted to see if you could get me a part as the comedic
Absolutely.
relief.
You'd be a lead.
When is the Feathers? When is the Feathers Push coming
Feathers
out?
Push is coming out middle of September. Should be available for pre-order everywhere. You can go to noelzamot.com, noelzamot.com, and there's a big button there for pre-orders. And love to hear what people think about it.
Awesome. And as always, you can find us, The Fourth Age, on Substack, Spotify, and Apple.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marty and Noah. It's been great.